Hello. Today I want to share with you a little bit of a retrospective on the journey that we've been taking at Merck in the context of data-rich experimentation. I had given a presentation a number of years ago by now at AIChE where we introduced a number of the concepts that we were actively investing in. And I wanted to kind of kind of touch base a little bit today on how that's transpired and what that's meant. I'm going to talk a little bit less perhaps technically about the technologies that we're developing, but really want to kind of emphasize some of the challenges that we've observed and some of the benefits that we've seen, particularly in the context of what that means in terms of operating through a pandemic as an example. So I wanted to start by kind of framing up this notion of the necessity for us in the pharmaceutical industry to accelerate the pace of development. I mean, I think a little infographic there around the information that required historically for a particular program and the project timeline that might be associated with that. As our industry evolves and as the expectations that are placed around us or as the molecules that we're interested in making become more complex, all of these various factors kind of lead to an increase in the information that's required for us to prepare and deliver as part of a regulatory submission, as an example, or as part of our process development to understand and to develop a robust and reliable process. That's increasing, right? So the actual information required is ever increasing. And by extension, the time to do so, the resource investment timelines are getting shorter, whether that's from a cost perspective or from the desire to be first or faster to market, or as a result of late stage acquisitions of assets, et cetera, right? So we're trying to be really cognizant of the notion that we have to be more nimble, we have to be more rapid in the development activities that we do. And data-rich experimentation is the, let's say, key enabler that we have invested in order to help us to kind of shape that particular, to kind of increase the slope, if you will, of the pace of development. So maybe a little bit about what is DRE, right? Data-rich experimentation means different things to different people. That can be automation, process analytical technologies, or PAT. It can be high throughput experimentation, robotics. It can be integration of process modeling, simulation, efficient and novel experimental design strategies, et cetera, et cetera. It can mean a lot of different things. I'm going to talk about it today using automated lab reactors as a backdrop, although any of those technologies, you can make arguments about the notions of cultural adoption or the notions of deployment that I'm going to hint at today are relevant for pretty much any one of those technologies there. So what does DRE mean to us here at Merck? So I sit within the small molecule process R&D organization, particularly in enabling technologies part, and I lead a small group of chemists and engineers that are the DRE team at Merck. I've kind of showing here on the screen what our mission and vision are. I'm not going to read through the whole thing here, but really kind of targeting maximizing the knowledge that we generate in all the work that we do, as well as innovation through trusted partnerships, to talk about kind of collaboration and how we think about that. I also want to kind of highlight what aspirationally we're trying to accomplish, right? So one of it is about really embedding these types of tools into our organization's cultural identity and to the fabric of our daily work lives. So, really wanted to kind of highlight what is it, how do we get there? How do we think about that? And how do we progress through that life cycle? I'm just giving a couple of infographics or pictograms around kind of example data-rich experimentation tools. Like I said, I'm going to kind of focus on automated lab reactors or benchtop automation, specifically in the context of Mettler-Toledo's AutoChem reactor platform, automated lab reactor platform. But we do also invest in other technologies that are perhaps, for example, smaller scale but higher throughput. In the medium throughput space, that's a device like the AmigoChem, or in even higher throughput, a robotic platform like the ChemSpeed Swing as an example. But again, again, part of the point here is for me to kind of walk you through a little bit of our DRE journey, especially in the benchtop automation space. So really focusing on what does it mean to kind of develop and deploy benchtop tools. I thought I would start doing that with a little bit of an example of what does our current utilization rate of automated lab reactors look like here in Rahway. So again, we're kind of talking in the context of Mettler-Toledo's automated lab reactor platform. We're leveraging AIChE Data Center as a tool to kind of monitor utilization. And here I'm showing you a graphic of the number of experiments conducted, colored by the number of project or colored by project in our space from the very beginning of us kind of collecting these metrics. What you can see is that there's been a gradual but consistent increase in the number of experiments conducted per month. This is attributed to a number of different features. One of that kind of notion about higher expectations with regard to information gained or data density, like I kind of hinted at that first slide there, or abbreviated project times, again, like hinted at there. It's also a reflection on our increased investment. So we actually have purchased a much broader infrastructure of automated lab reactors over that time period. But perhaps more interesting or more useful is an expanded user base and a wider cultural adoption. So if you were to plot the number of unique users over this time period, you would see a pretty correlated increase in the number of users over that period of time. And again, I want to kind of talk about this notion of cultural adoption a little bit more deeply, because while the technologies are enabling and while there's some really interesting and useful and exciting kind of technological topics we could talk about as it relates to that, I think one of the things that's perhaps been a little bit more interesting to me has been what is it that we do in order to drive adoption of new and novel technologies like these. I want to kind of use as an example a book by Jeffrey Moore called Crossing the Chasm as a backdrop for some of these conversations. It's been really instrumental in my kind of thought journey, if you will, across this, in this space. I want to kind of share a little bit or a little bit of that with you. So one of the central tenets, if you will, of crossing the chasm is really kind of highlighted here. You can kind of break up the user base of a new technology into a number of different kind of buckets, really two kind of main segments. One is kind of the early adopters, kind of on the left there. That represents kind of tech enthusiasts, visionaries, etc. And on the right side, you have kind of the mainstream market. This is the majority of the people in a particular organization, but also the people perhaps less eager to develop and deploy new technologies to solve the challenges that they have, pragmatists, conservatives, skeptics, etc. But perhaps what's most important about this is the notion that the transition from the early market to the mainstream market, or going from early adoption to main adoption, majority adoption, is there's this divide, right, that the author calls the chasm, right? And what we are really interested in understanding and really thinking about is how is it that we kind of prevent new technologies from kind of languishing as they're trying to cross the chasm, or how do we as early adopters play a really important role in making sure that technologies are able to kind of cross that chasm in a useful and effective way. So I'll give you a little bit of kind of my personal life, if you will. If we think about life according to a tech enthusiast, which I do consider myself a tech enthusiast. A snapshot on the left is how I smoke a pork shoulder. I'm into barbecue. That happens to be the output from an app-enabled, PID, temperature-controlled, fan-controlled smoker accessory that I use. On the right is how I brew espresso every morning, right? So this happens to be again, app-enabled smart scale that's used for kind of tracking, improving performance, and kind of saving results on in a real-time basis. The concept of data-rich experimentation is obvious to me. This is very much the core, central to my being, if you will. And if I extend that to the concept around data-rich experimentation in a lab setting, tools like automated lab reactors or PAT or high-end robotics, medium throughput platforms, et cetera, like I've mentioned previously, these tools are obvious to me too, right? Like this is a relatively straightforward sell for me. It's a relatively straightforward sell for the rest of the population that kind of self-identifies as early adopters, and, enthusiasts, et cetera. But again, that represents a pretty small portion of the community, the potential users of technologies. So I want to kind of shift a little bit and talk about what does the quote unquote mainstream market look like in the chemical development space. And again, kind of images on the right there are a snapshot into what the chemical development process still looks like in a pretty large percentage of our organization, or a pretty large percentage of our industry. These are still the tools of the masses, right? So round bottom flasks for running reactions, hot plates for heating them, syringes for sampling out of them, et cetera, right? And there's a lot of reasons why this is true. Some of them are important reasons that we can't ignore. Some of them are even valid reasons that we shouldn't ignore. But obviously there's plenty of reasons that are not so great and plenty of reasons to abandon them, et cetera. When we think about the notion of technology adoption or culture, change management and kind of cultural elements of this, there's a couple of different strategies that you can think about. One is you could just simply throw them out, throw out every single round bottom flash your company owns, give people no choice but to adopt modern technologies. As you can imagine, that can be super disruptive, but likely effective. You can mandate it from above, so you could actually set a set of expectations through management, et cetera, that kind of drive to particular outcomes. Sure. You can incentivize through economics. We have a system called Inspire, which is essentially like our internal currency, where you can give coworkers and peers small awards that translate to a small either gifts or things like that that can be used to purchase things. Yeah, sure, you can do that. But what we've chosen to do, and the way we've chosen to tackle this notion, is try and set a set of expectations that are around the data collected as well as the knowledge built. So again, really try to drive home some of those notions around the need for accelerating the pace of development and enabling more rapid and deeper understanding build, and the tools that are obvious for enabling that become the tools by which people meet those expectations. It's a little bit of the long game. It's been a long game for us. 5 or 6 years ago, we were still introducing some of these technologies, but this has been, again, slow and steady type wins the race type of activity or endeavor for us. And I think it actually has reaped significant reward. I want to talk a little bit about another notion that is highlighted within that particular book. It's this notion of the whole product. If you think about what the mainstream market is in the context of adoption of new technology in the chemical development space, one of the things that one feature of the mainstream market, whether those in it recognize it or not, is the expectation that they're going to be delivered a fully implemented solution, a fully kind of supported solution, if you will. It's something the author refers to as the whole product. Obviously there's, on top of that, expectations around very high data quality, as well as a very low tolerance for failure, particularly on the first engagement that a potential user has, right? So it has to be right, it has to be useful, et cetera. That's the expectation. Whether or not that's realistic is kind of irrelevant, because that's the perception that folks have, but that is the reality in this situation. But obviously the concept of delivering on the product for us has actually driven this notion of hypercare, right? It ends up being a core focus of our group, the data-rich experimentation group, is to be the boots on the ground, supporting adoption of new technology in a number of different ways. I've listed a couple of different examples. I'm not going to go through them, but the concepts around local expertise, being the local repairman, doing back-end data analysis in support of investigations that a scientist might be executing. These become the daily responsibilities of someone who is, presumably a tech enthusiast or an early adopter or visionary, but is trying to help gain a foothold within the later market segments, if you will. Yeah, so, and then something like this happens, right? So talk a little bit about what does, how does our investment in new technology centered around data-rich experimentation, how has that enabled us to be productive in the face of very challenging circumstances that I know many of. I want to talk a little bit about, again, what prior investment in technologies like this, so data-rich tools, has done as an enabler for return to work. Mettler Toledo actually recently published a white paper on the notion of COVID-19 recovery in chemical R&D. I'd encourage you to track it down and to read it. It's very interesting and very useful, very relevant. I agree with the vast majority of the content in that particular white paper. From Merck's perspective, I would say that our extensive existing infrastructure enabled us to get back up to speed very effectively, very rapidly. The fact that we had a well-trained user base that was largely self-sufficient, we weren't reliant on external support structures, again, enabled us to get back to work and be productive again very rapidly. I do want to take a really quick minute to highlight the Easy Sampler in particular. That's actually a really interesting and useful kind of use case in the sense that as an automated sampling device that is, let's say, compatible with the existing automated lab reactor platforms from Mettler, it actually removed one of the more significant time sinks of reaction execution for a lot of scientists at Merck. As we kind of mandate as an organization minimization of time on site for our employees, one of the things that folks used to have to stick around to do is to take samples after they had added all of their reagent into a reactor or after they had hit the play button, if you will, on an automated lab reactor. So people were still sticking around, poking a syringe into a reactor to take a sample every 30 minutes or hour or 2 hours, whatever it might be. The Easy Sampler, broader deployment of the Easy Sampler to the organization really did enable folks to kind of set up their reaction in the morning, program an Easy Sampler to take samples throughout the day as well as the following evening, and then they go home. They're out of there by 10 a.m. So they've been on site for maybe an hour or two, but still not sacrificing the data integrity or the data quality that, again, we're kind of setting as that expectation for our scientists. Talk a little bit about kind of investment in new technology. Obviously, all of us have had to come up with new ways of working. One of the new technologies that we've investigated is the HoloLens from Microsoft Teams. So we've rapidly deployed a small fleet of HoloLenses as a tool to do remote collaboration. For those who aren't familiar, HoloLens is a mixed reality solution from Microsoft, similar to something like Google Glass that you might be more familiar with, but it enables kind of real-time remote collaboration, hands-free setting, allows you to pretty effectively and to collaborate remotely much more effectively than we historically could have. It very much kind of simulates the shoulder-to-shoulder work that we were used to doing. So a very impactful and very useful technology for a number of programs, and one that undoubtedly was beneficial for us in the early onset of the pandemic. Okay, so before wrapping up, I just want to kind of bring back that same figure that I showed earlier, but I extended it to essentially last week or 2 weeks ago. So essentially now I'm including 2020. Again, same figure on the left, but on the right-hand side of that figure, what you can see is that, March and April were a little bit low months for us. We were mostly off-site for the end of March and early April. But starting in May, we were back to what was almost normal productivity from an experimental execution perspective, while still being maybe 10 to 15% lab occupancy. So very much a reduced workforce on site, but still getting to comparable levels of reaction productivity. Again, a reflection on the value that automation can bring to a conversation like this. And then, and as June, July, and August rolled around, as we start bringing more and more scientists onto site, you can see that we're starting to eclipse the highest productivity months that we've ever seen. So still able, even in the midst of an ongoing pandemic, start to experience some of our most productive days or months that we've ever experienced. So really encouraging that investment in new technology is able to help us weather a really complex storm like this. So just kind of in closing, last parting thought, kind of circling back to this notion of crossing the chasm is the concepts around the pandemic being a bridge across the chasm, right? So thinking about how our previous investments in data-rich experimentation technologies, both new and established technologies, but as well as kind of investment in new ones, has really enabled us to be, continuing to be productive, continues to enable us to drive forward, it improves the information density of the experiments that we execute or the pace at which we can move programs forward, has really been key to maintaining productivity and success in this challenging time. With that, thank you very much for your attention, including my contact information here, as well as on other parts of the iPoster. Thanks again.